Hello everyone. Today I am going to talk about mechanisms, which is one reason I'm sitting by the piano, which is a mechanism and one I will come back to in due course. Mechanisms are of interest to both positivists and interpretivists, those who work who do quantitative research, who search for regularities and correlations that can be used to make predictions, are often frustrated by the imperfect nature of those correlations. They don't allow them to make the kinds of predictions they want. So some within this tradition have argued that quantitative research needs to be supplemented by efforts to explore mechanisms. What do we mean by mechanisms? Mechanisms are the links that connect a supposed cause with its theorized effect. There is a chain of logic and of events that connect the two. For many quantitative researchers, this is opening a kind of Pandora's box. This is so because many of the mechanisms that might be invoked to explain outcomes of interest to them involve non-observables. In other words, metaphysical concepts, things, processes imagined by humans, but not directly detectable. Marx's dialectic is a classic example. So some researchers in this tradition have redefined a mechanism to mean a correlation at a deeper level. Case in point is John Elston, a prominent both practitioner and theorist of positivist political science. Elston offers the example of somebody who's just broken up with his or her partner. And one defense mechanism that comes along is to tell yourself that he or she really wasn't worth the effort, that it was a bad choice. But if you engage in this kind of defense, then you begin to wonder, well, how could I have been so wrong or dumb to choose this person in the first place? What's wrong with me? Elston suggests that in this situation, two things happen, that different people choose different defense mechanisms, and when they're dissatisfied with the one they've chosen, may look for others. In essence, he's saying that the choice of defense mechanism may be related to some underlying condition. So he suggests that we look for correlations at another level. The problem with this kind of approach, as both Russell and Wittgenstein recognized long ago, is that it leads to an infinite regress. At whatever level you look, there will still be uncertainty and imperfect correlations. So you're forced to go to yet another level in the hope to explain it. Und so weiter, as the Germans would say. So positivists have a difficult choice. They can try to restrict themselves to mechanisms that are only observables, but there are few such mechanisms. Or they can engage in some degree of reification and combining metaphysical concepts with observable ones. This, of course, is not a problem for those in the interpretivist tradition who reject outright the notion of Humean causation, on which regularity theories and much quantitative research depends. For interpretivists, thick understandings of causation are essential, and what distinguishes thin from thick is its focus on mechanisms, the chain of steps that seem to link a cause to its effect. Now, some mechanisms can be mechanical, and it's this kind of mechanism to which positivists feel most drawn. Consider my piano here, which is out of tune for the moment. But you hit these keys. This is a physical, mechanical motion. Inside the piano, a hammer strikes a string which vibrates, transforming mechanical energy into acoustic energy. Through a frame and sounding board, that sound is magnified, and it would be more greatly magnified if I opened up the top. If we take our finger off a key, dampers intervene and stop the sound. If by contrast we hit a pedal, we prolong the vibrations and the sound continues. So what produces music on a piano is a combination of carefully designed mechanisms that work in sync together. And you could argue, if somebody's performing a piano concerto before an orchestra or a jazz band playing the piano, that the piano is one of several machines that are working together to produce a larger musical outcome. Now, it's difficult to find such machines in politics. The closest I think we come is elections. Elections represent a carefully designed machine with polling places, people present to verify your right to vote, machines or ballots on which you vote and which are intended to guarantee both privacy and non-tampering with outcomes and making them easier to count. And elections are a machine designed to get public feedback on those who would seek political office. Now, they can be tampered with and used to subvert that process, but nevertheless, they're still a machine designed for an intended purpose. Most mechanisms in politics and international relations are not like that at all. They're much looser, they're more amorphous, they tend to be less well defined, and most importantly, they're not creations of human beings, even though human action may be involved in helping them have their effects. In using mechanisms, they differ from your standard toolbox. One of the metaphors we always see in social science and international relations, that people have toolboxes and use the tools or toolkits to perform particular kinds of research. Mechanisms aren't this way because they don't have the shape and the common shape and purpose of most tools. As I noted earlier, they're more amorphous kinds of concepts. This means that rather than just using mechanisms to offer thicker understandings of cause. We have to theorize those mechanisms very carefully to make their use credible and effective. And toward this end, I suggest that there are really three dimensions that interpretivists need to think about when addressing mechanisms. The first is generality. Is this a mechanism that has narrow implications with regard to its consequences, or very broad ones, or do they vary in the circumstances? I mean, take for example the so-called Arab Spring, which you probably know began with street demonstrations, somebody burning himself in Tunisia, led to a change of regime in Tunisia, rebounded throughout the Middle East where there were demonstrations and demands for change, although very rarely as effective as in Tunisia. What made this possible, researchers argue, was a combination of the internet and social media. Pictures of what was happening could be uploaded and broadcast around the world, made accessible to others who might want to demonstrate, and indeed be used to coordinate demonstrations and bypass the otherwise control of the media and telephone and other forms of communication by these regimes. But it's clear, if we follow this through, that these mechanisms worked to differing degrees in different countries. They had enabling conditions. And while focused in this case on a very narrow objective, which was mobilizing popular support out on the streets to register protest against the regime, we could think of the internet as something that has much broader and as yet really unknown consequences. There are people who talk about it as creating very different bubbles in which people live, reducing the extent to which people with differing views communicate or even understand one another. The internet has certainly encouraged the spread of fake news, of the penetration of political systems and public media by foreign powers or interest groups. It might be a threat to democracy, or in the long term it might end up encouraging democracy by mobilizing people and giving them access to more information. We don't know. And I suspect the answer will be both. And the outcome here will depend very much on other conditions. So mechanisms operate in context. And this brings me to the second dimension that we need to think about, which is specificity. So we need to specify the conditions under which a mechanism has the effects to which we impute it has. It's very clear that this is a very difficult question to answer. So consider something like an assassination. I mean, there are assassinations every year. Sometimes all they do is change governments or change leaderships in non-governmental groups, terrorist groups, for example. Every once in a while, assassinations can have much greater consequences, as did the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie at Sarajevo in 1914. That touched off World War I. specification involves trying to discover conditions that enable mechanisms to work, hinder how they work, or channel them down certain pathways. So this is a very large research agenda. It suggests that the study of mechanisms is at least as important and difficult as the study of causation, the reason mechanisms are being mobilized to begin with. And finally, we come to the third dimension here, which is determinancy. When a mechanism appears, what is it that enables it to have its effect? So here we're drawn into the study of context, and we have to try to understand why mechanisms like assassination sometimes have an effect and sometimes don't. If we stay for a moment with the assassination example in 1914, we see that this particular assassination had its effect because of 6 important consequences. See if I remember them all. In the first place, it removed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand from the inner circles of Austrian policymaking, and he was far and away the strongest supporter of peace. He believed that a war with Russia would destroy both empires. The Emperor Franz Joseph, also a peacefully inclined man, was nevertheless outraged by the assassination, not the first by any means of a member of his family, and was persuaded to draw his sword. Thirdly, the Austrian Chief of Staff, Franz Konrad von Hötzendorf, was the biggest warmonger in Austria and had personal reasons, which I won't go into, as to why he wanted war. Franz Ferdinand was about to have him removed from office, but instead he was given free rein, and along with Austria's foreign minister, pushed Austria in the direction of war with Serbia. Then we come to Germany. Germany's Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, was propagandized by Chief of Staff Moltke and his assistant Deputy Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn into believing that war with Russia and France was inevitable, and that the longer Germany waited, the less chance there would be of victory. But Bethmann-Hollweg was a politician. He knew there was no chance of a war or having credits voted for a war unless he could bring the Social Democratic Party along. To do this, he had to make the war look like Russia's fault. This is, of course, what happened in 1914, because the Russians mobilized in response to the Austrian ultimatum and declaration of war against Serbia. And Bethmann-Hollweg and the Kaiser both were men of not the strongest psychological dispositions. That's a very nice way of putting it in the case of the Kaiser. They therefore needed to believe that they weren't setting things in motion, but merely responding to a chain of events that constrained them in such a way that they had no other choices. So this particular assassination was as much of a cause as a pretext. And it raises the deeper question for data sets, but also for interpretivist understandings of war, of the consequences of not being able to take immediate causes or catalysts for an event, for war in this particular case, for granted. So you may well have had data sets in which underlying conditions push toward war, but there's no war because there's no appropriate catalyst. If catalysts are independent and meet many conditions, as Sarajevo did, as opposed to being streetcars where you really wait and sooner or later one will come along, then it undercuts the value of data sets based on underlying or so-called structural conditions. It compels one, whether you're a positivist or interpretivist, to roll up your sleeves, see the connections, and look at the conditions in which the combination of underlying and immediate causes will have an effect. Well, my talk has only really scratched the surface of the problem of mechanisms, but I do hope it has given you some respect for their importance and some notion of the kinds of questions that we need to ask about them. Thanks.